They called me the family disappointment while my brother Jake became the town's golden boy detective. Sarah never amounted to much, they'd whisper at family dinners. At least Jake made something of himself in law enforcement. But when Jake's police chief walked into that room, looked directly at me, and said, "Commissioner, ma'am," their faces went white as sheets. Because they had no idea who I really was. They called me the family disappointment while my brother Jake became the town's golden boy detective. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah never amounted to much, they'd whisper at family dinners. At least Jake made something of himself in law enforcement. But when Jake's police chief walked into that room, looked directly at me and said, "Commissioner, ma'am," their faces went white as sheets, because they had no idea who I really was. Growing up in Cedar Falls, Iowa, our family home was a shrine to Jake's achievements. The living room mantel displayed his high school football trophies, his criminal justice degree from Iowa State, and photos from his police academy graduation. His detective badge sat in a custom frame next to newspaper clippings about cases he'd solved. The local paper had dubbed him Cedar Falls' finest when he made detective at 28. My own accomplishments were invisible. While Jake's bedroom walls were covered with certificates and awards, mine held a single small flag from my deployment ceremony, tucked behind my dresser where guests wouldn't see it. Mom always said it looked too military for the main areas of the house. Every Sunday dinner was the same routine. Dad would lean back in his chair, beer in hand, regaling whoever would listen about Jake's latest case or commendation. "That boy's going places." He'd beam. "Chief material, mark my words." Always knew he had leadership in him. When the conversation inevitably turned to me, the tone shifted. "Sarah's still figuring things out," Mom would say with that tight smile reserved for uncomfortable topics. "You know how it is with some kids. They just take longer to find their path." The neighbors knew Jake by name. Mrs. Henderson next door would wave excitedly whenever his patrol car pulled into the driveway. "There's our local hero," she'd call out. Kids in the neighborhood would run up to see his badge and ask about catching bad guys. Me? I was just the other Martinez kid. The one who'd joined the army right after high school instead of going to college like Jake. The one who'd run away to the military because I couldn't handle real responsibility. At least, that's how they told it. Family gatherings were exercises in patience. Cousins would surround Jake, asking about police work and detective stories. Aunts and uncles would praise Mom and Dad for raising such a fine young officer. I'd sit at the far end of the table, nodding politely, while they discussed Jake's latest promotion or the new patrol unit he'd been assigned to. "Sarah's in the army," Mom would mention when someone finally remembered I existed, her voice carrying the same tone she'd used to discuss a relative's unfortunate health condition. "She's stationed somewhere out west. We don't see her much." The assumption was always that I'd enlisted because I had no other options. That I wasn't smart enough for college, wasn't driven enough for a real career, wasn't capable of the kind of success Jake embodied. The military was where kids went when they couldn't make it anywhere else, at least according to Cedar Falls wisdom. Even our childhood bedrooms told the story. Jake's room remained exactly as he'd left it, a museum to his achievements that Mom dusted weekly. Mine had been converted into Dad's home office within 6 months of my enlistment. "No point letting good space go to waste," he'd shrugged when I'd asked about it during my first leave. The message was crystal clear. Jake was the success story, the one worth celebrating and preserving. I was the footnote, the family member they'd mention if pressed but never volunteer. In Cedar Falls, there was Jake Martinez, the detective, and then there was his sister, the one who disappeared into the military and never quite measured up. The contrast in how we were treated became painfully obvious during my first leave home. Jake had just been promoted to senior patrol officer, and Dad threw him a backyard barbecue with half the neighborhood invited. There were congratulations, handshakes, and talk of his bright future in law enforcement. When I walked through the door in my dress uniform after 18 months overseas, Mom glanced up from the potato salad and said, "Oh good, you're back. Can you help me carry these chairs?" No welcome home party, no celebration, just chairs that needed moving. When Jake graduated from the police academy, our entire extended family drove 3 hours to attend the ceremony. Grandma Martinez even flew in from Phoenix. The photo album from that day was thick with pictures. Jake in his dress blues, the family beaming with pride, group shots in front of the academy building. They framed his academy graduation photo and hung it prominently in the hallway. Why military promotion ceremonies happened thousands of miles away, witnessed only by my unit. When I made sergeant, I called home excited to share the news. "That's nice, sweetheart," Mom had said, her voice distracted. "Hold on, Jake's trying to tell me about this robbery case he's working on." The financial support told the same story. When Jake needed a new car for his commute to the precinct, Dad co-signed a loan for a gleaming Ford Explorer. "Can't have Cedar Falls' finest driving around in that beat-up Honda," he'd laughed. When my transmission died during a brief home visit, I was told there wasn't room in the budget. "You're good with fixing things," Dad had shrugged. "Military teaches you to be resourceful, right?" The double standard extended to how our careers were discussed. Jake's police work was serving the community and, quote, making a real difference. My military service was just following orders, and not really a career, more like a temporary thing. When Jake arrested a drunk driver, it made the local paper. When my unit received a commendation for our work in Afghanistan, it didn't even make dinner conversation. Even our romantic lives were subject to different standards. Jake's girlfriend Rebecca was welcomed into the family like a daughter. Mom would cook special meals when she came over, Dad would tell his best stories, and everyone acted like she was already part of the Martinez clan. When I brought home David, a fellow soldier I'd been dating for over a year, the reception was politely cold. "Military relationships never last," Mom had whispered to Aunt Carmen, loud enough for me to hear. "Too much distance, too much stress." The most painful example came during Jake's 25th birthday party. The backyard was decorated with streamers, and Mom had ordered a custom cake with a police badge design. The guest list included his colleagues, high school friends, and extended family. Dad gave a speech about how proud he was to have a son in law enforcement, how Jake was carrying on the family tradition of service to the community. I had turned 25 3 months earlier, during my second deployment. The acknowledgement had been a brief phone call and a card that arrived 2 weeks late. "Sorry we missed it," Mom had said when I mentioned it. "You know how busy things get here." When Jake solved his first major case, a string of break-ins that had the whole town worried, the celebration lasted for weeks. The story was retold at every family gathering, with new details and embellishments each time. When I earned my combat medic certification and saved 3 lives during a convoy attack, the response was a distracted, "That's good, honey," during a hurried phone call. The message was unmistakable. Jake's achievements mattered because they happened in Cedar Falls, where people could see them and understand them. My accomplishments happened in a world they couldn't picture, doing work they couldn't comprehend, so they simply didn't count. In their minds, real success had to be visible, local, and understandable to be worthy of celebration. The breaking point came during Christmas dinner 3 years into my service. I had managed to get leave and flew home from Fort Campbell, excited to spend the holidays with family after missing the previous year due to deployment. The house was festively decorated, and for once, I thought maybe this visit would be different. Jake had just made detective, the youngest in Cedar Falls history, and the celebration had been going on for weeks. The Christmas tree was surrounded by congratulatory cards from city officials, fellow officers, and proud neighbors. His detective badge sat in a place of honor next to the nativity scene, catching the light from the twinkling tree. During dinner, Uncle Robert raised his glass for what felt like the 100th toast to Jake's promotion. "To our family's finest," he declared, showing the whole town what the Martinez name stands for. Everyone clinked glasses and beamed at Jake, who soaked up the attention with his characteristic easy smile. I sat quietly, cutting my turkey and listening to the familiar chorus of praise. Then Cousin Maria, Jake's age and newly graduated from nursing school, turned to me with that polite but pitying expression I'd grown to recognize. "So Sarah, Still playing soldier? She asked with a laugh that wasn't quite mean but wasn't kind either. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When are you going to come home and do something real with your life? You can't hide in the army forever. The table fell silent for a moment. Then Dad chuckled and patted Jake on the shoulder. Well, at least one of my kids chose a respectable career. Law enforcement actually matters in people's lives. That's when something inside me shifted, not broke, shifted, like a gear clicking into a different position. I had spent 3 years proving myself in ways they couldn't imagine. I had led missions in hostile territory, made split-second decisions that saved lives, earned the respect of soldiers who'd been fighting longer than Jake had been wearing a badge. I had been selected for advanced leadership training, recommended for officer candidate school, and quietly building a reputation that extended far beyond Cedar Falls. But in this dining room, decorated with Jake's achievements and filled with people who saw my service as an extended phase of rebellion, I realized something crucial. I would never earn their respect by waiting for them to understand what I'd accomplished. They would never value what they couldn't see or comprehend. That night, lying in my childhood bed, or rather Dad's office with an air mattress, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of trying to make them see me, I would build something so undeniable that their perception wouldn't matter. I opened my laptop and began researching officer paths I'd been considering but hadn't pursued. Military police, criminal investigation, leadership positions that would take me into federal law enforcement after my service. Jake thought he was the only Martinez who could excel in law enforcement, but he was working within a system I was learning to navigate from the inside. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Jake was solving local cases and earning praise from a small town, I was being groomed for responsibilities he couldn't imagine. The Army had identified leadership potential in me that my family refused to see. My commanding officers spoke about career paths and advancement opportunities, about federal positions and specialized units that recruited from military backgrounds. Over the following months, I stopped calling home with updates about my service. I stopped trying to explain my work or share my achievements. Instead, I focused entirely on building something they would eventually have to acknowledge, whether they understood it or not. Wow, I applied for officer candidate school. I volunteered for every specialized training opportunity. I studied law enforcement procedures, federal regulations, and criminal justice systems with the same intensity I'd once reserved for hoping my family would notice me. This time, I wasn't building for their approval. I was building for my own future, one that would eventually intersect with Jake's world in ways none of us could have predicted. While Jake was earning commendations for solving burglaries and traffic stops, I was quietly building an empire they couldn't see. Officer candidate school was just the beginning. 18 months of intensive training that pushed every limit I thought I had. Leadership exercises at 0500, tactical planning sessions that ran until midnight, and constant evaluation by instructors who didn't care about my family's opinion of my potential. I graduated second in my class and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in military police. But instead of celebrating with phone calls home, I buried myself deeper into specialized training that most officers never even knew existed. Advanced criminal investigation, counterintelligence operations, federal law enforcement liaison programs. Each certification was another step towards something bigger than Cedar Falls could comprehend. My days started before dawn and ended well after midnight. While other officers were relaxing in the barracks, I was studying federal regulations, memorizing criminal codes, and attending advanced seminars on multi-jurisdictional investigations. I volunteered for every challenging assignment, every dangerous mission, every opportunity that would expand my expertise. The Army took notice. Within 2 years, I was selected for the Criminal Investigation Command, CID. While Jake was investigating shoplifting cases, I was working fraud investigations involving millions of dollars, drug trafficking operations that spanned multiple states, and criminal cases that required coordination with FBI, DEA, and Homeland Security. My commanding officers began mentioning opportunities I'd never imagined. Federal task forces, joint operations with civilian law enforcement, leadership positions that came with responsibilities Jake's entire police department couldn't handle. But I kept these conversations to myself, maintaining the same humble silence I'd perfected during family dinners. Inajan. The irony of my situation wasn't lost on me. I would call home occasionally, listening to Dad brag about Jake's latest arrest, or Mom gush about his new patrol route assignment. They would ask about my work with the same polite disinterest they'd shown since my enlistment. "Still doing that military police thing?" Mom would ask, as if it were a hobby I'd eventually outgrow. If only they knew that their military police thing included leading investigations that local detectives like Jake would never be qualified to handle. That I was routinely briefed on cases involving national security, organized crime, and federal violations that required clearance levels Jake had never heard of. My personnel file grew thick, with commendations, special assignments, and recommendations from superior officers who saw potential my family had never recognized. I was selected for advanced leadership courses alongside officers destined for the Pentagon. I received specialized training at Quantico, working alongside FBI agents and federal prosecutors on cases that would never make the Cedar Falls newspaper. The physical demands were relentless. 6-mile runs before breakfast, combat training that left me bruised and exhausted, tactical exercises that tested every skill I'd developed. But the mental challenges were what truly transformed me. Strategic planning sessions where split-second decisions could affect multiple agencies. Interrogation techniques that required psychological insight Jake's police academy had never covered. Evidence analysis that involved federal laboratories and expert witnesses from across the country. By my 4th year of service, I was managing investigations that crossed state lines and coordinated with agencies Jake couldn't name. My security clearance granted access to information that would make his detective cases look like parking violations. But when he called to brag about solving a convenience store robbery, I would listen with the same supportive enthusiasm I'd always shown. The hardest part wasn't the work, it was maintaining the facade. Pretending my achievements were modest when I was earning recognition at levels far beyond local law enforcement. Listening to family friends praise Jake's real police work while I coordinated with federal agencies on cases involving national implications. But I had learned patience in ways my family never understood. Every challenge I overcame, every skill I mastered, every level of responsibility I achieved, was building towards something they would eventually have to acknowledge. I wasn't just becoming a better soldier, I was becoming someone whose authority would be undeniable. By my 6th year of service, I had achieved something that would have been unthinkable to my family back in Cedar Falls. I was now Major Sarah Martinez, Deputy Commissioner of the Iowa State Police Criminal Investigation Division, a position that put me in charge of coordinating all major criminal investigations across the entire state of Iowa, including Cedar Falls. The promotion had come through a federal-state partnership program that recruited military officers with advanced criminal investigation experience. My background in multi-jurisdictional cases, federal liaison work, and leadership experience made me one of only 12 candidates selected nationwide for these positions. The ceremony took place in Des Moines with the governor in attendance, but my family wasn't there. They didn't even know it had happened. My office in the state capitol building overlooked the same highways that led to Cedar Falls, where Jake was still working as a detective, a position he thought represented the pinnacle of law enforcement success. What he didn't know was that his cases now fell under my ultimate jurisdiction. Every major investigation in his department required approval from my office. Every federal coordination request crossed my desk. The responsibilities were staggering. I managed a budget that exceeded the entire operating cost of Cedar Falls city government. My decisions affected hundreds of officers across dozens of counties. When drug trafficking operations were discovered spanning multiple jurisdictions, my team coordinated the response. When federal agencies needed state-level support for major investigations, they called my office. My security clearance now granted access to intelligence briefings that influenced statewide policy. I sat in meetings with FBI directors, DEA administrators, and Homeland Security officials who consulted me on operations affecting the entire Midwest region. The cases I reviewed daily involved millions of dollars, international criminal organizations, and threats to public safety that local police departments couldn't comprehend. But perhaps the most ironic aspect of my position was the oversight it gave me of local law enforcement agencies. Every police department in Iowa, including Cedar Falls, had to meet standards that my office established. Training requirements, procedural compliance, federal coordination protocols. All of this flowed through systems I now managed. Jake's department had submitted several requests for federal assistance over the past year, all of which had been reviewed and approved by my office. His name appeared on case files that crossed my desk regularly, though he had no idea his sister was the one authorizing the resources he needed to do his job effectively. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal. The uncertain young woman who had left Cedar Falls feeling like a disappointment had become someone who commanded respect in rooms filled with the most senior law enforcement officials in the country. My recommendations influenced policy at the federal level. My expertise was sought by agencies that most local police officers only read about in training manuals. My apartment in Des Moines reflected this new reality. Awards from the Department of Justice lined the walls. Commendations from federal agencies sat on my desk. Photos from high-level conferences showed me alongside officials whose names appeared regularly in national news. But in my bedroom, tucked away where no one else could see, I still kept that small deployment flag from my first assignment, a reminder of how far I'd traveled from the invisible daughter who once sat at the end of the family dinner table. The most surreal moments came when I reviewed intelligence reports that mentioned Cedar Falls. Seeing my hometown through the lens of statewide criminal patterns, demographic analysis, and resource allocation made me realize how small that world really was. The world where Jake was celebrated as a big fish in a very small pond. Yet I maintained the same humble silence that had characterized my entire military career. When my assistant announced calls from federal agencies or scheduled meetings with state officials, I handled each responsibility with the quiet competence I'd developed over years of being underestimated. None of them knew that the disappointment they'd written off was now responsible for protecting their safety in ways they couldn't imagine. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing a multi-county drug trafficking case. My assistant's voice carried an unusual excitement as she announced, "Major Martinez, you have a call from Detective Jake Martinez in Cedar Falls. He says it's urgent and that he's your brother." I paused, my coffee cup halfway to my lips. In 6 years of federal law enforcement, Jake had never called my office. He didn't even know I had an office, let alone one with jurisdiction over his department. I told my assistant to put him through, curious about what could be urgent enough for him to track down my work number. "Sarah?" Jake's voice carried a mixture of excitement and desperation. "Thank God I found you. Listen, I need a huge favor. Like, career-making huge." He explained that Cedar Falls was dealing with their biggest case in decades. A sophisticated fraud operation that had bilked elderly residents out of nearly $2 million. The scheme involved fake investment companies, forged documents, and money laundering through multiple states. It was exactly the kind of complex multi-jurisdictional case that typically overwhelmed small-town police departments. "The FBI is sending someone to coordinate the investigation," Jake continued, his voice filled with nervous energy. "This could make my entire career, Sarah. If I can work directly with federal agents on something this big, I could write my own ticket, maybe even get recruited to a federal task force." The irony was breathtaking. Jake was calling me the family disappointment, hoping I might have some minor military contact who could put in a good word for him with federal law enforcement. He had no idea he was asking the person who would actually be coordinating the FBI response. "The thing is," he went on, "I heard through the grapevine that military police sometimes work with these federal task forces. I know it's a long shot, but do you know anyone? Anyone at all who might be involved in this kind of investigation?" I listened to my brother, the golden child, the local hero, the one whose achievements had overshadowed mine for our entire lives, essentially begging me for help with a case that was already sitting on my desk. The request had come through official channels 3 days earlier. I had personally reviewed the case files, approved the resource allocation, and scheduled the federal coordination meeting. "Jake," I said carefully, Tell me more about what you need. He launched into an explanation of how federal investigators would be arriving in Cedar Falls next week for a coordination meeting with local law enforcement. The meeting would determine which local officers would be selected for the Joint Task Force, which could lead to federal training opportunities, advanced certifications, and the kind of career advancement that small-town cops dreamed about. Dad always said you never amounted to much, Jake continued, his voice dropping to a more vulnerable tone. But I know you've got to have met some important people in the military. This is my one shot, Sarah. Could you maybe make some calls? The setup was perfect, almost poetically so. Jake would get his federal coordination meeting, the very meeting I had been planning to attend as the senior state official overseeing the case. He would walk into that conference room expecting to meet some faceless federal bureaucrat who might or might not give him the career opportunity he desperately wanted. What he would find instead was his sister, the one the family had written off, the one whose achievements they'd dismissed, the one whose potential they'd never recognized, sitting at the head of the table with the authority to determine his professional future. Don't worry, Jake, I said, allowing myself a small smile as I looked at his case files spread across my desk. I'll make sure you get to meet exactly the right people. The coordination meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning at the Cedar Falls Police Department. I arrived 30 minutes early, dressed in my formal state police uniform with all the insignia that reflected my actual rank and position. The conference room where Jake had probably dreamed of making his career-defining impression was about to become the setting for the most shocking family reunion in Martinez history. Chief Patterson, a weathered veteran who'd been running the Cedar Falls Department for 15 years, greeted me in the lobby with the nervous deference that local officials typically showed state-level administrators. Commissioner Martinez, it's an honor to have you here personally. I have to admit, we weren't expecting someone of your rank for a local coordination meeting. Sometimes these cases require direct oversight, I replied, keeping my voice professionally neutral, while internally marveling at how Chief Patterson had no idea he was about to witness his detective's world turn upside down. Jake arrived exactly on time, straightening his tie as he walked through the front door with the eager confidence of someone who believed this meeting would launch his federal career. He'd clearly prepared extensively. His notebook was filled with detailed case notes, his questions carefully organized, his entire demeanor radiating the desperate hope of a small-town officer trying to impress federal investigators. Chief Patterson made the introductions as we entered the conference room. Detective Martinez, I'd like you to meet our state coordination officer for this investigation. This is Major Sarah Martinez, Deputy Commissioner of the Iowa State Police Criminal Investigation Division. Jake stopped walking. His notebook slipped from his hands and hit the floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, then opened again without any sound emerging. The confident expression he'd worn while preparing for his career-making moment dissolved into pure shock. Sarah? He finally whispered, his voice barely audible. What? How? You're the state coordinator. I stood at the head of the conference table, my uniform crisp and professional, my badges and insignia clearly visible in the fluorescent lighting. The very sister he'd called asking for help. The family disappointment who he thought might know someone important, was the someone important. Good morning, Detective Martinez, I said formally, extending my hand for a professional handshake. I understand you're the lead investigator on the Elder financial fraud case. I've reviewed your preliminary reports. Solid work. Jake stared at my outstretched hand like it was a foreign object. Chief Patterson looked back and forth between us, clearly sensing an undercurrent he couldn't identify. The FBI liaison, Agent Rodriguez, who had arrived just behind Jake, watched the scene with the trained observational skills that came with federal law enforcement experience. Commissioner, Agent Rodriguez interjected, should we proceed with the briefing, or do you need a moment? The question hung in the air like smoke. Jake's eyes moved from my face to my uniform to the case files I'd spread across the table, files that contained his work, reviewed and approved by the office I now headed. The little sister who used to sit quietly at family dinners while he basked in praise for his police academy graduation was now the person with authority over every major criminal investigation in the state. No moment needed, I replied calmly, taking my seat at the head of the table. Detective Martinez and I can maintain professional standards. Can't we, Detective? Jake nodded slowly, mechanically, still processing the impossible reality that his forgotten sister had not only amounted to something, but had amounted to more than he'd ever imagined possible. He picked up his notebook with trembling hands and took the seat across from me, looking like someone who'd just discovered gravity worked backwards. The meeting proceeded with military precision, and with each passing minute, the full scope of my authority became impossible for Jake to deny or rationalize away. Agent Rodriguez deferred to my recommendations on resource allocation. Chief Patterson requested my approval for overtime authorizations. The FBI liaison asked for my signature on federal coordination documents that would determine the entire trajectory of the investigation. Commissioner Martinez has final approval on all task force selections, Agent Rodriguez explained to the room, pulling out a tablet to display the organizational chart. Her office coordinates with Justice Department protocols and determines which local officers receive federal certification for joint operations. Jake's pen froze over his notebook. He was staring at the organizational chart, where my name appeared at the top of a hierarchy that included his department, his chief, and every law enforcement agency in the state. The career opportunity he desperately wanted me to help him obtain was literally in my hands, and had been all along. Chief Patterson, finally sensing the family connection, cleared his throat awkwardly. Commissioner, I wasn't aware that Detective Martinez was related to you. Family relationships don't influence professional decisions, I replied evenly, opening the case file with Jake's work. Detective Martinez has submitted thorough preliminary reports. His understanding of local victim networks and community dynamics makes him a strong candidate for the federal task force. The room fell silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Jake looked up from his notebook, his expression cycling through disbelief, embarrassment, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. Agent Rodriguez continued the briefing, pulling up financial tracking documents on his laptop. The Commissioner's office has been monitoring this operation for 6 months through interstate banking alerts. Her team identified the money laundering patterns before any local agencies detected the fraud. 6 months. I had been aware of the criminal activity affecting Jake's town for half a year, coordinating with federal agencies to build a case that would eventually land on his desk as the opportunity of his career. While he was investigating parking violations and domestic disputes, I was tracking the very criminals he would later discover, ensuring that when the case became public, local law enforcement would have the federal support needed to handle it properly. The investigation will require coordination with agencies in 7 states, I explained, spreading intelligence documents across the table. Money movement through Illinois, Wisconsin, Missouri, Nebraska, Kansas, Minnesota, and Iowa. Asset seizure requiring federal court orders. Victim interviews coordinating with social services and elder protection agencies across multiple jurisdictions. Jake stared at the documents. Federal intelligence reports, multi-state coordination memos, Justice Department communications, all bearing my signature and authorization codes. This wasn't just a case that had been assigned to me. It was a case I had been building from the federal level while he was still writing traffic tickets. Chief Patterson leaned forward, clearly trying to process the implications. Commissioner, what kind of federal certification would Detective Martinez need for this level of coordination? I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick folder labeled Federal Task Force Candidate Evaluations. Jake's name was already on the list, but not because of anything that had happened in this meeting. His evaluation had been completed weeks earlier based on his case reports, performance reviews, and recommendations from his supervisors, all of which had been processed through my office as part of standard federal coordination protocols. Detective Martinez has already been pre-approved for Level 3 federal task force participation, I announced, sliding the authorization document across the table, pending completion of this coordination meeting and his acceptance of the assignment. The paper landed in front of Jake with his name printed in official federal letterhead, signed by officials whose ranks exceeded anything he'd imagined reaching. His career-making opportunity hadn't come from networking or luck. It had come from his sister's professional evaluation of his qualifications, reviewed through systems he didn't even know existed. After the meeting concluded and the federal agents departed, Jake and I found ourselves alone in the conference room. The authorization papers were spread across the table between us like evidence of a reality neither of us had fully processed. Jake sat motionless, staring at documents that represented everything he'd worked toward, signed by the sister he'd spent our entire lives underestimating. "Sarah," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't understand. How long have you been this?" I could have savored the moment. Could have reminded him of every dismissive comment, every family dinner where my achievements were minimized, every time he'd been celebrated while I was overlooked. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that I could have made him feel as invisible as I'd felt for years. Instead, I chose a different path. "Jake, do you remember when we were kids and you taught me how to throw a curveball?" I asked, my voice softening from its professional tone. "You spent hours in the backyard with me, even though I was terrible at it. You never made me feel stupid for not getting it right away." He looked up, confusion replacing the shock in his eyes. "That's who you really are," I continued. "Not the golden child that Mom and Dad created, but the brother who is patient with his little sister. The officer who stays late to help victims file reports properly. The detective who actually cares about solving cases, not just advancing his career." I stood and walked around the table, removing the formal distance between us. "This federal task force isn't charity, Jake. I reviewed your casework objectively, and you earned this opportunity. Your victim interviews show genuine empathy. Your evidence documentation is thorough. Your community relationships are exactly what federal operations need." Jake's eyes began to glisten. "But I called you asking for help like you were nobody important." "You called me because you trust me," I replied. "That matters more than you know. Do you want to know something? Half the federal agents I work with are brilliant investigators but terrible with people. You have skills they can't teach in Quantico." I pulled out a chair and sat beside him instead of across from him. "The family dynamics that made us compete with each other were never really about us, Jake. Mom and Dad needed a success story they could understand, so they chose the path that looked familiar to them. But success isn't a competition between siblings." "I feel like such an idiot," he said, shaking his head. "All those years of thinking I was the successful one while you were out there doing this." "You weren't an idiot," I assured him. "You were working within the system you knew. I just found a different system. And now we have a chance to work together." I reached for the task force authorization document. "This opportunity is real, Jake. You'll be working with federal agents on cases that matter. But more importantly, you'll be representing Cedar Falls in a way that actually helps people. Isn't that why you became a cop in the first place?" He nodded slowly, and for the first time since we were children, I saw my brother without the weight of family expectations or competitive dynamics. Just a good officer who cared about doing right by his community. "There's one condition," I added with a slight smile. "Family dinners are going to be very different from now on." Jake laughed, a real laugh that broke the tension entirely. "Mom's going to faint when she finds out." "Probably," I agreed. "But maybe it's time they learned that success comes in forms they never expected. And maybe it's time we stopped measuring our worth by their understanding of it." The conference room that had witnessed the most shocking revelation in our family's history became the place where two siblings finally found their way back to each other. 3 months later, I stood in my childhood living room, but everything had changed. The mantle that once exclusively displayed Jake's achievements now showcased both of our careers. His detective commendations sat beside my federal service awards. His police academy graduation photo shared space with a picture of me receiving a commendation from the Attorney General. The family shrine had become something neither of us had ever expected, a celebration of two different paths to the same destination. Mom buzzed around the kitchen, preparing dinner with nervous energy, still processing the reality that her disappointing daughter outranked every law enforcement officer in the state. Dad sat in his chair, occasionally glancing at the newspaper article about the successful conclusion of the elder fraud investigation, an article that prominently featured both Martinez siblings working together on a federal task force. The case had been a complete success. Jake's community connections and victim interview skills had proven invaluable in identifying patterns that federal databases had missed. His ability to gain trust from elderly victims had led to recovery of assets that might have been lost forever. The federal agents had been so impressed with his work that he'd been offered a permanent position on the regional task force, an opportunity that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. But the real transformation wasn't professional. It was personal. Jake had called me every week during the investigation, not as a younger brother seeking help from connections, but as a professional colleague discussing case strategy. We'd developed a working relationship built on mutual respect rather than family hierarchy. When he struggled with federal protocols, I guided him through them. When I needed local community insight, he provided perspectives that my state-level position couldn't access. Uncle Robert, who had once praised Jake as the family's only success story, now couldn't stop talking about having not one but two law enforcement professionals in the family. Federal task force coordination, he would tell anyone who'd listen. Sarah's got clearance levels I can't even pronounce. The most profound change was in our parents' understanding of success itself. Dad had started asking detailed questions about my work, genuinely trying to comprehend the scope of responsibilities he'd never imagined. Mom had framed my commissioning certificate and placed it in the front hallway where guests would see it immediately upon entering. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation was in how our extended family now viewed both of our careers. Cousin Maria, who had once asked when I was going to do something real with my life, now brought her college-aged daughter to family gatherings specifically to meet me. Sarah's proof that women can achieve anything in law enforcement, she'd tell her daughter, conveniently forgetting her previous dismissive comments. Jake had changed too. The competitive edge that had characterized our childhood had been replaced by genuine pride in my achievements. He would introduce me to his colleagues, not as his sister who got lucky, but as Major Martinez, the state official who coordinated their federal training opportunities. He'd begun studying for federal certification exams, inspired not by jealousy, but by the realization that law enforcement offered paths he'd never considered. The ripple effects extended beyond our immediate family. Other military veterans in Cedar Falls had started reaching out to me for career guidance, realizing that military service could translate into civilian law enforcement opportunities they'd never explored. Jake had become an advocate for veteran recruitment in his department, understanding now that military experience brought skills that traditional police training couldn't provide. During our most recent family dinner, something unprecedented happened. Instead of competing for attention or recognition, Jake and I found ourselves collaborating on a presentation for the Cedar Falls City Council about community policing strategies. We were combining his local knowledge with my federal training experience to develop programs that could serve as models for other small departments. The conversation around the dinner table had evolved from praising one child at the expense of the other to celebrating how different strengths could complement each other. Dad talked about Jake's community relationships and my federal coordination skills as equally valuable. Mom discussed both of our careers with the same pride and detailed knowledge she'd once reserved only for Jake's achievements. But the most important lesson wasn't about family dynamics or career success. It was about the danger of allowing others to define our potential. For years, I had internalized my family's limited vision of what I could accomplish. I had almost accepted their narrative that I was the supporting character in someone else's story. The truth I want every woman watching this to understand is that your value isn't determined by other people's ability to recognize it. Your potential isn't limited by their capacity to imagine it. Sometimes the people who love us most are the least equipped to see who we can become, especially when we're growing beyond the boundaries of their own experience. I spent years building my career in silence, not because I was ashamed of my achievements, but because I had learned that some people need to see success before they can believe in it. That's not your responsibility to manage, but it's important to understand. To every woman who has ever been told she's not leadership material, who has been dismissed as not ambitious enough, who has been relegated to supporting roles while others take center stage, your time will come. But don't wait for permission to claim it. Don't wait for recognition to start building it. Don't wait for understanding to start achieving it. Build your empire in the quiet moments. Develop your skills when no one is watching. Create your opportunities when everyone assumes you're just getting by. And when the moment comes for revelation, and it will come, let your work speak louder than their assumptions ever could. Success isn't about proving other people wrong. It's about proving yourself right. And sometimes, the greatest victory isn't changing their minds about you. It's reaching the point where their opinion no longer defines your worth. The quiet ones, The overlooked ones. The ones who are told they'll never amount to much. We're not waiting for permission anymore. We're building the future they never imagined we could create. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.